The Woman is unsurprisingly a movie about a woman. Gross. Another Jack Ketchum novel brought to the big screen just like The Girl Next Door. And much like The Girl Next Door, is a movie about a female being held captive in a basement by some sort of sadistic, not very nice person who's probably compensating for something. And, well, it also turns out that this movie is a continuation of another movie called Offspring from 2009, which itself is based on a book that happens to also be a sequel of another book. And upon further research, apparently this movie itself also had a sequel called Darling. So why did I decide to cover an entry midway through the series and not start at the beginning like a normal person? I don't know. Look, I was way too far into the video once I realised that. I don't know what that says about me as a person, but I know it means that we're all in for the ride together now. Plus, it does hold up on its own as a standalone story. You could watch this without ever realising that it's a continuation of anything, which is exactly what I did for about half of the movie. The movie begins with an injured woman walking through a stream, getting her feet absolutely soaking wet. A problem that she could have easily solved by wearing a pair of today's sponsors, Vessi Stormbursts. Incredibly comfortable, stylish sneakers with all of the features of a rubber winter boot, including being 100% waterproof, not water resistant, for all of your various wet feet activities that you like to get up to. Don't worry, I won't judge. They're waterproof and warm, yet lighter and more comfortable than boots. They have a lugged rubber outsole that gives you extra grip in wet conditions, and they slide on and off with ease. They even have an added lining inside for extra warmth in the cold, which makes them the perfect pair of sneakers if you just so happen to be the sole survivor of a cannibalistic tribe trudging through the soaking wet. Disclaimer, Vessi does not support and will not be held liable for any of your cannibalistic activities. Being made from Dymatex, a soft knit material that keeps your feet warm in the cold, but cool in the warmer months, they don't feel like they should be waterproof, but they are. What I love about Vessis is when I'm strolling through the deep wetness of the secluded forests, getting up to my totally non-nefarious and perfectly legal activities, my feet always remain warm and dry. Check out the Vessi Stormbursts and other styles at vessi.com/bigwill, get your Vessi sneaker in size you want now, and use code BIGWILL for 15% off your entire order. After tracking a wolf to a cave, asserting her dominance by growling at it, and asserting her dominance some more by killing it, it cuts to a man named Chris, a lawyer with his family at a party. It's Chris, his wife Belle, son Brian, and two daughters, Peggy and Darlin. Right from the get-go, it's pretty heavily hinted at what type of a person Chris is, with him dismissing his wife and making her feel small, while on the surface acting like everything he's doing is perfectly normal, before then telling his son that his basketball shots aren't good enough because he's not getting them all in. All is well in the world. My wife is obedient out of fear for her safety, and my child feels worthless. With this point being emphasized the next day, as when he heads out hunting, we see the look in his wife's eyes that looks like the gaze of someone whose soul has been completely broken. It's already conveyed its point perfectly on screen. Chris doesn't need to do anything outright bad for us to know that he's more than likely a monster behind closed doors. Well, and open doors too, I guess. He is a lawyer. While Chris is out hunting, he spots the clearly injured woman bathing in the stream. And apparently the sight of a naked woman causes him to get overexcited as he returns the next day to throw a net over her before knocking her unconscious. We see that Chris's son Brian also has a healthy relationship with the women in his life, as when he loses a game of basketball to a girl, he decides to secretly put gum in her hairbrush and watch as she gets it stuck in her hair. He's in love. Back at home, we see that Chris has brought the woman back to his property and has had her restrained and strung up in his outdoor cellar. While he's checking over her body, not valuing his fingers, he puts them in her mouth, and unsurprisingly, she bites the tip of one of them off. I don't think that's what he meant when he said just the tip. In retaliation, he repeatedly punches her in the face, but with blood dripping down from her mouth, she doesn't give him the satisfaction and just smiles at him. And not being able to stand the sight of a happy woman, he knocks her unconscious. After tending to his wound, he heads back down there and she immediately lunges at him. He tells her that he wants to introduce her to his kids as if she's not some kind of kidnapped feral woman strung up in his basement, but tells her not while she's being disobedient. So in order to punish the defenseless woman, he puts ear protection on and fires off a gun right next to her ear. And as he leaves her to get closely acquainted with her new lifelong friend known as Tinnitus, he heads back to the house and brings his family to the cellar to show off his cool new toy. All the while, his wife has the look of, oh my god, he's actually doing this, but why am I not the least bit surprised? He thinks he's playing Pokemon or something. Gotta catch 'em all. He tells the family that they're going to train and civilize her. He views her like a pet and not a human, almost as if she's his personal little project. He thinks he can control people and change them to his liking, which is evident with his wife. She clearly doesn't endorse or approve of the things that Chris does, but she wouldn't dare to try and put a stop to it. Almost as if she's physically and mentally beaten down over the years to do exactly what he says without so much as a question. They try to feed her a bowl of oatmeal, but as it's not currently attached to another living human, she isn't too keen on it and knocks it over using her head. And later on in the evening, Chris's youngest darling comes back outside and sits on top of the cellar door, where she proceeds to play her toy radio for the woman. It helps her sleep at night, so she thought it might be comforting for her too. It demonstrates that Darling is yet to be corrupted by her father's ways. She still views the world through the lens of innocence and clearly doesn't realise just how truly demented her father is and the things that he does. And perhaps for the only time in the movie, Belle tries to speak up and questions Chris over whether or not this is actually the right thing to do. And without hesitation, without so much as skipping a beat, he slaps her across the face before tucking himself into bed without him even acknowledging what he's just done. He will be in control at all times and he will not be questioned. Much like he's attempting to do with the woman in the cellar, there will be consequences until you learn to shut your mouth and blindly follow. With the apple not falling too far from the tree, as the next day, while sitting alone in class for some reason, maybe he's just lost all his friends by being a sore loser and putting gum in their hair, Brian cracks a smile while thinking about the injured, defenseless woman currently being held captive in his cellar. We also see Peggy at school having a totally understandable reaction to having to do gym class as she lays down on the floor and begins to cry. Not only is her father up to some pretty horrendous things with her mother, it's also perhaps hinted at that there might be something else going on between Peggy and her father also, as the previous night he sat down beside her in bed and she looked absolutely terrified the whole time. The same can be said about most scenes containing them both. She either looks as if she's disassociating from the world around her or on the brink of tears. And after one of her teachers notices that she's been nauseous a lot, only now wears baggy clothes, and does not attend gym class, we realise that Peggy's pregnant. But we don't know who the father is. Maybe she's simply terrified of her father because of the way he is, or maybe she's terrified because he's the real father. It'll be a bit awkward when they're both calling him dad. We then see the woman finally deciding to lean down to eat her extra crunchy oatmeal, before seeing Brian drilling a hole into the cellar door to watch the woman, before using a piece of gum to cover it, before his dad discovers the forbidden glory hole. Chris and Belle head down to the cellar and using 2 big buckets of scalding hot water, proceed to clean up the woman, cause she kinda stinky. And after Belle watches Chris scrub her chest, she picks up a plank of wood and looks as if she's either going to use it to attack Chris or the woman. Until eventually, after a long drawn out scene, she points out to Chris that her restraints are coming loose. It's like she knows what Chris is doing is horrifically wrong, and despite the fact that he physically and mentally abuses her, she's jealous of the fact that he's touching another woman. And after bringing the woman outside, she looks at Peggy's stomach to almost say that she knows that she's pregnant and that baby is her favourite meal. The only problem being is that it requires 9 months in the oven. Chris then proceeds to spray her with a power washer after rubbing boiling water all over her body, and the woman then speaks in English and says please. Which, rather unfortunately for the woman, gives Chris a sick sense of justification, as he now believes his methods are actually working, which means there's not going to be an end in sight for his horrific behaviour. In fact, it's only going to escalate. He puts on this facade, and acts as if this is a way to civilise the woman and to change her ways. Of course, it's apparently obvious that this is really just a way for him to horrifically torture someone while bending the truth to give himself some sort of moral high ground. But all of that is thrown right out of the window, as later that night, when he thinks his family is asleep, Chris sneaks out of the house, alerting his son Brian as he does. And Brian, following his dad, then watches through the hole in the cellar door as his father proceeds to light a candle and then sexually assault the woman as she stares blankly at Brian through the hole. All the while, Belle is actually awake, knowing exactly what Chris is up to. The next morning, we learn that Brian only has a half day at school, and his father tells him,
"Don't do anything I wouldn't do."
So being a decent human being is off the table then. And later that day, we see Brian returning home from school, finding a note saying his mother is out at the moment, and not realising that Peggy is also off school, lying on the sofa. So, not doing anything his dad wouldn't do, Brian heads down into the cellar where the woman lunges at him, and he offers her a cookie. And after she denies the cookie, he realises that there must be something seriously wrong with her, as he proceeds to violently attack her with a pair of pliers. Peggy hears the woman's screams and comes running to find that Brian has given this woman an impromptu nipple piercing as well as stab marks all over her body. And after Peggy tells her mother, we learn that he was also inappropriately touching himself and the woman while inflicting the pain. Belle, for once finally deciding to stick up for this disgusting behaviour, tells Chris what happened, and he simply responds with,
"Boys will be boys."
I see, problem solved then. After he tells Belle that he doesn't blame Brian, as she doesn't look half bad now she's been cleaned, Belle finally breaks and begins screaming at him, saying that it's just not right. She tells him that she's had enough and she's done with his abusive behaviour. He can keep Brian, because he looks kind of funny, but she's taking both of the girls and is leaving. To which, Chris begins hysterically laughing, before punching her twice in the stomach and once in the face. All the while, Brian is sitting there smiling. And as she lays there, motionless on the floor, suddenly someone knocks on the front door. It's Peggy's concerned teacher. After dragging Belle to the table, Chris invites the teacher in and says that his wife is just having a nap. Yeah, a forced nap. She asks Chris if Peggy has a boyfriend, and after Chris says no, she tells him that Peggy is pregnant and that she's concerned about her. To which Chris finds to be incredibly insulting, as he goes from a calm and collected demeanour while he casually talks to his daughter's teacher to loud and assertive as he asks her, "Are you accusing me?" Seems like someone with something to hide. And before the teacher really has any time to process the insanity of this situation and how it's exploded into chaos from nothing in a matter of seconds, he slaps her across the face and drags her across the lawn. He throws his pregnant daughter to the floor, ties the teacher to the fence, and grabs Penny while he proceeds to tell her that she's only good for one thing before throwing her to the floor again. He drags the teacher into the barn and locks her in the cage with the dogs. They're just about to break free from their restraints as Brian and Chris watch from behind the fence, when suddenly a deformed person emerges from one of the kennels and bites a chunk out of her neck, as we're now apparently watching the latest entry in the Wrong Turn series. The person then jumps onto the teacher's back before taking another bite out of them. Perhaps the family simply weren't as shocked as you'd expect them to be when Chris brought the woman home, because this isn't the first time that he's done it. With his thoughts on their worth being pretty obvious, he forces this person to live with the dogs and has neglected them to the point that they've become feral. Peggy, screaming at her dad to stop, doesn't know what to do until she eventually decides that she needs to set the woman free to stop him. But what it does instead is cause the now freed woman to immediately head towards the freshly awake Belle, tackle her to the floor and give a new meaning to the term facelift by quite literally lifting it away from her face. We then see the teacher being given the forbidden hickey before witnessing the effects of wrestling on young people's minds as the woman picks up Belle and throws her across the garden. The dogs are finishing up what's left of the school teacher as we see the woman walk right past Peggy and pick up a piece of metal before opening the barn door. Using the piece of metal, she gives Brian the twin brother that he's always wanted, before knocking a gun out of Chris's hand, driving the metal into his guts, and pulling out his insides as if he's a human-sized piñata with extra internal fluids. She pulls out one of his organs and eats it right in front of him, before exiting to then see the feral person emerging from the barn, as they have no eyes and walk on their all fours. She feeds them a piece of Chris, before the pair proceed to walk towards the house. Darlin spots the woman, and refers to the other person as sister, which raises more questions than answers if I'm being entirely honest. Darlin gives the woman a bottle of water, and after she downs it, she puts her bloodied finger in Darlin's mouth, before taking her and walking off towards the woods. Peggy stands there, hesitating as she watches this orphan-creating cannibalistic woman walk off with her little sister, before eventually deciding to follow as well. The movie then comes to an end with a post-credit scene showing Darlin in an almost storybook-esque land as she sails across the sea and reaches an island where she's embraced by some sort of creature. And before we bring this to an end, I'd just like to give a massive shout out to all my YouTube members and patrons, the people who every month help support the content that I make, as it isn't guaranteed that every video is going to be sponsored, and as we've all heard 1,000 times before, YouTube isn't exactly fond of the type of content I make, but as well as just being great supporters and a big help, YouTube members and patrons also get access to a private Discord server, as well as access to uncensored versions of all of my videos. So if that's something that you're potentially interested in, maybe consider checking it out. So starting off with YouTube members, I just want to give a big thank you to everyone who signed up this week. Clapping their Momoga's cheeks, Hitman Jones, Damon Marjonovich, Ryan Donegan, Axe Freeze, Kyones Gaming, and Robert Johnson. And heading over to Patreon, a big thank you to Bungon Pavel, Comrade Ace, Yeezer, Giovanni Perez, Cherry Moonshine, Andrew Rogers, Jordan Caddy, Tony Nguyen, Dylan Baker, Rodney Farron, Fictitious Forces, Elon Greenberg, Colin, Denorio, Tyrick Conley, Commontage, Jack, Maximilian Hoffman, Jamie McDonald, Matthew McGlasson, Ben Preston, and Zachary Kincaid. So once again, a massive thank you to all YouTube members and patrons, and a huge thank you to everyone else for watching.